Welcome back to Buckeye Talk. Stephen Means, Nathan Baird, Andrew Gillis. About 2 years ago, when we were getting ready for the 2021 college football season, myself, Nathan, and Doug at the time did a bunch of Mount Rushmores. We called them Mount Buckmores because this is Buckeye Talk. We cover Ohio State Buckeyes. You guys get the point. And we did it position by position, and then we did a coaches one, and then we did an all-time one. For the most part, a lot of those Mount Rushmores have held up still because, especially defensively, because not a lot has changed. And even with the quarterback one, I think we're still a couple of years before we need to really update that one because not much has changed, I think, in how we view some of these quarterbacks. But the wide receiver one has changed abundantly, Nathan, especially with two guys who were going into their true freshman years when we did that in 2021 with Emeka Egbuka and, more importantly, Marvin Harrison Jr., who here as third-year guys, one of them already has one 1,000-yard season, and the other one already has two 1,000-yard seasons and has turned himself into a Heisman Trophy finalist. Nathan, I kind of said this a couple of weeks. Do you think it's about time that we updated that Mount Buckmore just because of how much has changed since the first time we did this?
Wide receiver is probably the one position that would need to be revisited the soonest because it has become such a focal point in this program in a way that it never was before. Not that it didn't have good receivers before, but it has become a focal point of this program. Both a focal point from the way that they recruit and way they can recruit receivers because of Brian Hartline internally, and from the focus that the football world has on Ohio State. It wasn't that long ago that people thought of Ohio State as, all these great defensive backs and all these great edge rushers. And, maybe like when I was growing up, you would have talked about, they seem to have like great running backs all the time. And now it is wide receivers is like number one, like quarterbacks and receivers. That's what you think about when you think about Ohio State football, what they produce right now as far as NFL talent that then goes out into the country and spreads the brand of Ohio State football. So it does make sense that of all the positions, this is the one that needs to be revisited the most or the soonest, but it needs to be revisited the soonest because of only one player. I think. Mostly because of one player, and it's the guy we're going to mostly talk about today, probably.
That is, Andrew, Nathan and I have done this exercise before, so we've had to get familiar with these names. But I sent 15 names out to the texters. Get the text 614-350-3315 if you want to participate in surveys, get news, get analysis, get anything. To your phone first, 2-week free trial, $3.99 after that. Everybody I included, the only person on that list who doesn't fall under one of these two categories of I've had an 1,000-yard season during my college football career, or I was a first-round draft pick, was Michael Thomas. And I only included him for reasons of that guy probably should have had an 1,000-yard season in his career, and his NFL career, at least the start of it, was more proof of how underutilized he was even in that time period under Urban Meyer. But everybody else on that list has had at least one 1,000-yard season or was a first-round draft pick. Of those names, how many of those guys were you familiar with? How much deep digging, how much research that you have to do for a pod like this?
So, you see names that, look, I was born in 96. So you see some names that you go, oh, okay. And then you see some names that you're like, I remember that. I was in high school or I remember growing up. And then you look at some names and you're like, oh God, oh boy, this is tough. So yeah, there are some unique names on there that I was like, I had to look up and I had to be curious about. So yeah, it was a unique exercise. I'll put it like that. There were some names that I forgot, or that I just had never heard of. Paul Warfield. That was something for me where I was brand new. But like, I remember watching, like Ted Ginn, and I remember Terry Glenn with the Cowboys. Like, that's how I remembered some of these guys. So it was a unique exercise, I think, for me, at least for me.
So here are the guys who just didn't make the top 10 for the Texans, and I'm assuming none of these guys are in your top 10 as well. First and foremost, here's our Buckmores from 2021, Nathan, Doug, and I's. Here's Nathan's. He had Ted Ginn, number 1 overall, Chris Carter, number 2 overall, David Boston, number 3 overall, and I believe Michael Thomas was number 4 overall for you during that season. For myself, I had Chris Carter number 1 overall, Michael Jenkins number 2 overall, David Boston number 3 overall, and Ted Ginn Jr. number 4 overall. And then Doug, Chris Carter, Ted Ginn Jr., Michael Jenkins, and then David Boston. Those were our original Mount Buckmores from that year. For the Texers from that year, Chris Carter, number 1, Ted Ginn Jr., number 2, David Boston, number 3, and then Joey Galloway, number 4. So a little variety, but a lot of the same names on those lists. Updated rankings. These guys, I'm assuming, did not come into your guys' top 4 whatsoever. They weren't on the Texers' top 4 either. These are the guys outside of the top 10. Number 11 was Michael Thomas, as I mentioned. Number 9, 93, was his weighted rank score. Jackson Smith-Njigba, who has the record for most catches and most yards in a single season in 2021, but didn't need a chance to repeat it. Probably would have had multiple 1,000-yard years had he had the opportunity to, but he came in at number 12, 9.99. And then Paul Warfield, who Andrew already mentioned, who he was a wide receiver for what that era meant for wide receivers. He played in the early 60s. He came in at number 13, 11.80. Emeka Buka, 12.27. He was number 14. Then Paris Campbell, who was the original owner he broke the record in 2018. He wasn't the original owner, but he broke the record for most catches in the season in 2018 with 90 catches. He came in at number 15, with a 13.96 weighted rank score. But as Nathan said, let's get into the guy we're all here to talk about. Nathan, I am assuming that Marvin Harrison Jr. is on your Mount Buckmore.
I don't think the question anymore is whether Marvin Harrison Jr. should be on Buckmore. I think the question is whether he should be number 1.
Yes.
I don't know how you would put him in the top 4. I don't know what list would put him in the top 4.
So is he number 1 for you on a list like this?
I think so. I think you've got a now it's hard because he hasn't done the next thing yet. He hasn't now gone on to the NFL, and you know, NFL status and accomplishments aren't the number one thing here, but when you have a lot of guys who did a lot of things, it becomes sort of a tiebreaker, which is how Michael Thomas was in such conversation the first time we did this, because at the time he was very recently removed from being like maybe pound for pound the best player in the NFL there for a couple of years, or certainly in the conversation. So that pushed him higher up. I imagine he probably will not fare as well today, and nor do I think he probably should. But Marvin Harrison Jr. is doing unprecedented things, even among this list of accomplished receivers. You know, to be a unanimous All-American, to now be on the cusp of true Heisman contention, like very likely good shot at going to New York, and is getting a lot of, in a year where there's no one quarterback stepping up and taking this, is getting a lot of consideration as a guy who maybe deserves this. A lot of pub out there that says, well, this is actually the pound for pound best football player. Like, doesn't that guy supposed to win the Heisman? And he's probably going to be a consensus All-American again. The first 2-time 1,000-yard receiver in Ohio State history. And again, like, the era matters. The fact that Ohio State plays this style of offense, and Chris Carter and David Boston and other guys didn't play, even Michael Jenkins didn't play in that kind of offense, that matters. But he's still stepping up and doing it. And I don't know, I think Marvin Harrison Jr. has just sort of redefined what an Ohio State receiver is going forward. This is the guy that people are going to get compared to going forward. It's now, as good as some of these other guys were. And I'm not trying to deify Marvin Harrison, but again, nobody else has done a lot of the things he has done, and there are still great accomplishments potentially in front of him.
I think the idea of not trying to deify Marvin Harrison Jr. went out the window when we decided to do it, an entire pod with him and the concept being around him. Andrew, he's 7th all time in catches in Ohio State history at 147. He is 7th in receiving yards with 2,465. As Nathan mentioned, the only guy with 2,000-yard seasons. Ohio State officially has 10 people who've had a 1,000-yard season. Well, 9 people, 10 different seasons have happened. He was responsible for the 8th one last year, and then Emeka Buka quickly followed, and now he's responsible for the 10th one. And then in touchdowns right now, he is 4th with 29, so he's about to be the 4th player in in Ohio State history to have at least 30. Chris Olave leads that conversation with 35. David Boston with 34. Devin Smith with 30. By the end of his career, obviously so much depends on what happens in that Michigan game, but potentially there's 2 regular season games left, a Big Ten championship game, and then 2 playoff games potentially. That's a lot of football. He could very easily be number 1 on all of those career lists by the time he is done here. And as Nathan mentioned, he's a Heisman Trophy final candidate, potentially a finalist, potentially the best player in the country. Was he number 1 on your list as well?
Yeah. The thing for me that was, Nathan brought up a good point, because the thing for me that I was kind of like, when I was looking at some of these lists and I was like looking at some of these numbers, it's like, okay, David Boston had, X amount of yards in the 90s. Like, how do you compare, like, what's the pivot there to compare X amount of yards to Marv? And how do you do that? That was kind of where I was kind of, I hit a wall and I was kind of struggling on how to compare him. But I put Marv number 1 just because when you look at the numbers and when you look at what he brings each week, you try to stay away from recency bias. You try to, like, I wanted to remove myself from that because it's a heck of a lot easier to talk about how Marvin Harrison Jr. is and like how great Marvin Harrison Jr. is than it would be, let alone like Chris Olave, like a Michael Jenkins or a Ted Ginn. Like, how do you, like, it's a lot easier to talk about him because he just played last Saturday and he's going to play again this Saturday and they're probably going to give him the ball a lot. So I did everything I could. I was maybe even harder on Marv than I was with some of these other guys, just because I was like, Marv is here. I'm like, I got to be respectful to history, but I looked at the list and I was like, the numbers back it up. Especially like when you consider that, it's really, significantly the last 2 years, the numbers back it up. I have eyes. I'm able to watch like YouTube highlights and see things, and he's just so good. And I put him number 1. And again, I think, like I said, I was a little bit harder on him because I was trying to say, maybe I should give more, more reverence to some of these older guys. But I had a hard time doing that. I had a hard time convincing myself that you could put anybody ahead of Marv right now.
So Nathan, we did this pod in August. So we were deep in the fall camp by the time we did this original Mount Buckmore pod for the wide receivers. Obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr., a freshman at that point, he came in as the number 97 player, the number 14 wide receiver at the St. Joe's Prep in Philadelphia that season. He was the 3rd highest rated receiver in that Ohio State recruiting class, behind Emeka Egbuka, who was the number 1 receiver in that class, and behind Jaden Ballard, who was the number 55 receiver in that class. But we had already been hearing some chattering. I think he was the first freshman to lose his black stripe that spring, very quickly into the spring. I think he got a touchdown pass in the spring game. We had already been hearing some of the chatter of, hey, this guy might be next. Hey, this guy might be next. But we just weren't going to see it in 2021 because Chris Olave, because Garrett Wilson were back, and because Jackson Smith-Njigba was a second-year guy in that situation. We're going to have a point in this pod where we're going to discuss, hey, is there anybody else who can potentially make this list in the future? Marvin Harrison Jr.'s name didn't come up on that pod. In hindsight, you can say, yeah, maybe we should have said Marvin Harrison Jr.'s name. But would it have been crazy to say that, hey, Marvin, we're already hearing good stuff about Marvin Harrison Jr. We see where this wide receiver room is headed. Maybe we should be thinking about him as a guy who potentially can get on a list like this. Not necessarily number 1, but just on this list with the way we were already hearing about him back in 2021. Or would that have been too far out there to even think about at that point?
Yeah, no. I mean, there's too many other guys. I mean, there's too many legitimate guys who've already had careers to start just, speculating about any one of the many recruits that were coming in that were going to be great receiver or projected to be great receivers. Would have been, I don't think, it would have been just pure speculation at that point because we knew so little. The first I remember hearing about Marvin Harrison Jr. as far as like people at Ohio State thinking something might be ahead of schedule was signing day, when Ryan Day was asked about the freshman early enrollees. And I think maybe the first name out of his mouth was like, oh man, like Marvin Harrison Jr. walked in here and that's not what I thought that's not what he looked like the last time I saw him or something like that. You know what I mean? Like there was a physical impression that Marvin Harrison Jr. made on Ryan Day. And it just sort of built from there. And we did get to see it before the end of that year. We got to see it obviously in the Rose Bowl to cap your freshman year where you did have like such a limited role. But to cap it with that performance, but that like wasn't even like the breathtaking performance of the Rose Bowl. That was still Jackson Smith-Njigba. And we weren't talking about Jackson Smith-Njigba on that 2021 episode because Jackson Smith-Njigba wasn't a thing yet. He was still like a speculative piece of that offense. He hadn't done yet what he had done. It was still kind of a footnote. So, but still, you're capping your freshman year with 3 touchdowns in the Rose Bowl. And at that point, you saw, even after that, I think we looked at him and we're like, that's a really intriguing, like, red zone weapon. So it'll be interesting when he, like, mixes in with all the rest of this. Jackson Smith-Njigba will come back in 2022 and do that again. And then Marvin Harrison Jr. can be, a big part of the offense, but, like, really maybe in the red zone, they look for him a lot. And then it just turns out that, well, Jackson Smith-Njigba doesn't get to have a 2022, and then Marvin Harrison Jr. just becomes the best receiver in college football, like, top to bottom, bar none. So it's funny how quickly these things change. And my list has changed a lot, like significantly, to the point where, again, I think these past 2 years, Marvin Harrison Jr. doing what he has done, Jackson Smith-Njigba doing what he did, Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson finishing their careers the way they did, and everything they accomplished, and everything, frankly, that they have now gone on and started doing in the NFL to enhance that. Mm-hmm. It has made me rethink what an Ohio State receiver is and how guys should be ranked. And my top 4 is quite different than it was in 2021.
Mine is 2. And it's unfortunate Jackson Smith-Njigba didn't get to repeat his performance because I think he easily is on this list as well if he doesn't get injured literally the first game of the season that year. So it's unfortunate. I think it's understandable why the Texans had him at 12, but I think he's probably in the 4, 5, 6 range if he has another year like what he had in 2021, especially as the focal point. Andrew, before I reveal who I'll just say it. No, the Texans had him at number 1, 2, and it was significant. 2.07, and he had 50% of the first place votes. So he was bar in between, clearly the number 1 guy. I have one caveat, though, I do want to ask you about, Andrew, because we do this with quarterbacks sometimes whether we sometimes put winning as a quarterback stat, and it does matter when you're having that conversation. Like, if we ever redo this with the quarterbacks, as good as C.J. Stroud was here, as good as he's been in the NFL so far, especially if he continues that pace, we're going to have to consider the fact that he never beat Michigan. Maybe. Well, depending on, we'll have some more finite answers on some things that we're going on with Michigan, hopefully, by the time we did a quarterback one. But does that matter with wide receiver as much? Because Marvin Harrison Jr. has, as great as he's been, he's never played in the Big Ten championship game yet. Now, we'll see. He might end up playing in one 3 weeks from now, and this is an irrelevant conversation. But he has yet to beat Michigan, and he played in a playoff game where he dominated on a playoff game, so at least we know what he looks like on the playoff stage. But the lack of a Big Ten championship and the lack of beating Michigan yet, did that factor anywhere into the conversation of how you were thinking about Marvin Harrison Jr. when thinking about putting him 1 or anywhere else on your Mount Rushmore?
Nope. I am not. I think the only win team achievement award, like if you're gonna say Big Ten title, national title, beat Michigan, like if you're gonna throw some of those accolades on, the only position that I'm cool with that is quarterback. And by cool with that, I mean the only position that I can even remotely hear it. And I'm not even a QB wins guy. Like, I think that there are so many other mitigating factors here because, like you mentioned, CJ Stroud never beat Michigan. Well, CJ Stroud scored 41 points against Georgia, and he led an offense, I should say, that he didn't do it himself. He led an offense that scored 41 points against Georgia.
He scored a lot of those points. So
Sure. But he was one part of an 11-man offense. And the biggest part of an 11-man offense, I will say. But, I mean, they win that game. They make a field goal at the end of the game. We are talking about C.J. Stroud, national championship winning quarterback at Ohio State. That's not his fault. Like, that's not his fault that he's, like, nobody did that to Georgia, and he did. and nobody was able to do that to Georgia and to put up those yards and to play like they did against Georgia. And he led that offense to play like they did against Georgia. So especially with some key guys down. So I winning, as dumb as this might sound, winning I don't care about when it comes to lists like this, because you could be great, like you could be awesome. Like, Lamar Jackson won the Heisman Trophy, and I think Louisville went like 8-4. Like there are wins, losses where you can clearly differentiate a player and say, you know what, that guy's balling, and his team just lost, and that happens. So yeah, winning and losing does not matter. Like Marvin Harrison Jr. Is anybody really going to say that Marvin Harrison Jr. is not number one anymore if he goes 8 for 110 and a touchdown against Michigan and they lose 24-20? Like is anybody going to say, oh, well, you can't put Marv there because, didn't beat Michigan, didn't win a Big Ten championship? Like, no. Marvin Harrison Jr. has deserved all the accolades that he should get. I understand that there are arguments to be made that, like, this guy may be boosted by it, but I'm not going to hurt a guy. I'm not going to take a guy down because whatever team he was on did not do something.
Well, here's the thing, though. It can definitely be a tiebreaker in a situation like this because you're comparing all-time greats, and the resumes start to look pretty similar at a certain point. So if someone has done the things that maybe makes them the runaway number one, which it sounds like, I'm a little surprised that it was that heavy from our texters to be number one, but I guess if we're all putting him number one, it shouldn't be a surprise. That if it's a runaway number one, then maybe it doesn't matter. Farther down this list, if you start comparing two guys and they're both in the same range on like career stats and NFL impact and just maybe the esteem that they have within the program, then I think you can absolutely say, well, this guy went 1-3 against Michigan and this guy went 4-0. And that's a difference for me. Or this guy was part of a national championship team. When I was considering, there was a guy that I actually did not end up putting in my top 4. But one of the reasons why I almost did was because he was part of a national championship team. And I thought that maybe that deserved special consideration. So I think it can be a tiebreaker. I don't think it needs to be as huge a part as you're saying, Stephen. Like when it comes to quarterbacks, you are judged differently, fairly. You're praised differently too. So it goes both ways. But I think C.J. Stroud would not argue with that being a deficiency in his Ohio State, not deficiency, but just something missing from his Ohio State career. And yeah, he has said it. He said it that day last year after the game. So quarterbacks know that's the part of the game. And I think it is a bigger part of that than it would be for a receiver.
Nathan, as I mentioned before, we also did like an overall Mount Buckmore where I think it was player only led. And obviously, I think number one on that list was Orlando Pace for obvious reasons. Is Marvin Harrison Jr. on a track that could have him in that conversation? You're talking about the 4 greatest players in Ohio State history, or is that a step too far?
It's a great question. I don't know what I feel about that. I hadn't thought of it. If you win the Heisman Trophy, and if he wins the Heisman Trophy and Ohio State wins the national championship, and he's a 2-time unanimous All-American and the first two-time 1,000-yard receiver in Ohio State history, and then goes on and does NFL things, he's going to be the first receiver off the board probably this next spring. I mean, I can't remember who else we put in that top 4, but I mean, I'm sure it was Pace, it was Archie. Who else was it?
It might have been Hopalong Cassidy, and I can't remember who the 4th one was. But the fact that I can't remember it off the top of my head, I think there are 3 clear ones, and it's Archie, Hopalong, and Pace. But
yeah, as we said at the time, there were guys who were sort of like on deck to maybe get in if things kept going, and that's going to apply, I think, on this receiver list that we come up with, because there were guys that had not finished their career in 2021. But there are some guys on deck. I mean, you've got guys, and the Bosa brothers are two of the best defensive players in the NFL right now. Like there's other guys that are still building their Buckmore resume.